every Monday morning, I have a Bible study with Pastor Jack over at the Methodist Church, and there's usually a couple other local pastors who join us, but Jack and I are pretty much always there. And we go over the Sunday lectionary for the week coming up. Now, I will tell you that Pastor Jack is probably a much better pastor than me, because he plans his sermons like several weeks in advance. And so he knows what he's going to be talking about. And so he's very helpful to me because I usually show up and I'm like, I haven't even looked at these yet, Jack, so I don't know. But as we were reading through the readings today, we got through the gospel, and the line that really jumped out at me is that Jesus is explaining what's happening, and the disciples did not understand, which is pretty typical of the disciples. But they were afraid to ask. And I thought about times in my life where I was afraid to ask for whatever reason. And one of the incidents, this is a really minor thing, but it jumped out at me, is when I was a teenager, when I was 17, I lived in Australia. I was there for a year. And I was in a class, I think it was a politics class, and I can imagine it to this day. And I'm sitting there and we're reading like a passage. You know, we're taking turns reading, and everybody liked it when I read because I had the exotic accent in Australia. And I'm reading, and I get to a word, and it's a word I've read before, and it's a French word, and it means sort of basically middle class, but the word, it begins with a B, and I had never heard it pronounced to the best of my knowledge. And I don't know if you know French, but I'm pretty sure French is a language invented by like dyslexic people because you only pronounce about one out of every 4 letters. And it's kind of random what letter that might be in any particular word. So this is a very long word. It probably has 11 or 12 letters. And in English, it would be pronounced Bergioisi. So I read out loud about the Bergioisi. And of course, everybody did just that. They all laughed at me. Of course, at 17, that was much more searing than it is today. But of course, the word is bourgeois. And I still, to this day, can't spell it. There's lots of O's and I's and E's in that word. But there's only like 12 of them, you pronounce like 3 of the letters. So I read the word bourgeois. And you know, and I knew as I was reading it that was probably not the correct pronunciation. I didn't take French in school. I took German, which is very literal. You pronounce every letter. But I knew that French was a little more complicated. But I never asked, how do I pronounce this word? I didn't say anything. I just sort of boldly jumped into Bergioisi, which of course elicited laughter every time. Every time you say Bergioisi, people laugh. Right? And I think that, this is not like an important thing, right? And I know there are probably all of us have had experiences like this, maybe not mispronouncing a word that we've only ever read and never said out loud. Another one is ennui. I have trouble with French, because that looks like ennui. I'm sorry, but anyway. You know, we probably all of us have incidents where we get led astray because we're afraid to ask somebody. We're afraid to speak of our ignorance, or we're afraid to look foolish. And in doing so, we often look more foolish than we might have been if we had just bothered to ask. If I had just said, like, I know this word, and I've seen it before, but I don't really know how to pronounce it, I'm sure the teacher would have said bourgeois, and that would have been fine. But I didn't. Right? And I'm sort of like the disciples who are arguing amongst themselves over who is the best disciple, when in fact they are all terrible disciples. They love Jesus for sure, and that's qualification number 1. And they're willing to follow him pretty much anywhere, which is qualification number 2, but they have zero clue about where they are going or why. They have no idea really why they're following Jesus, because their thinking is that they are going to Jerusalem to lead like an actual armed revolt and install themselves as the new rulers of Israel. And so they're arguing over who's the greatest because they want to know who's going to get the fanciest chair and the nicest clothes. And I don't know, have the biggest harem or whatever you get if you're the king in the first century. And Jesus has been telling this, as far as I can remember, this is the second time in like a short period of time that Jesus has explained to them what Jesus' mission is. Look, I'm here. There's going to be a conflict between me and the leaders of Israel. They're going to arrest me and they're going to kill me. Very matter-of-factly. But that's not the end of the story, Jesus wants to assure them. That 3 days after they kill me, I'm actually going to be alive again. The power of God is going to resurrect me. And of course, they don't understand it because, let's be honest, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't, because people, when they die, they don't pop back up 3 days later. That doesn't happen, except like in zombie movies. And that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not going to come back as a brain-eating zombie. He's going to come back as himself. And they don't understand it, and they're afraid to ask, what does that mean, Jesus, that you're going to die and be resurrected? I mean, what are you talking about? What does that mean for us? Why are we here if you're just going to go and get yourself executed? They don't ask any of those questions. And on one hand, that's sort of admirable. They just trust Jesus. They're willing to follow wherever he goes. They have blind faith, I guess. But on the other hand, it's not really very helpful, the perpetuation of Jesus' mission. Because Jesus has called these 12 for a specific reason. He's called one of them, of course, because he knows that one will betray him. But the others, he has called because he knows that they will be fearless and courageous in sharing the story of Jesus through the rest of their lives. That they will stand up against empires and natural disasters and anything that gets in their way. Nothing will stop them from sharing the good news, of taking the gospel out, of offering salvation to everyone they encounter. But Jesus also knows they're not there yet. So this whole story is about how do we, as followers of Jesus, come to understand our role? How do we get to the place where, instead of arguing over small matters of church life, which we don't really do here, which is a fantastic thing, FYI, but there are lots of Christians who do. But how do we move from there to the place where we are courageous and bold in proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ? Right? That how well do we understand what Jesus is up to and what his story is about and how it impacts us? How does the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus matter to me in my life? In what way is my life different because of this understanding than it would have been if I had remained forever ignorant of that? It's a question that all of us as Christians need to ask ourselves. How has faith changed the path of my life? How do I act differently? How do I move through the world in a way that is different than I would have otherwise? And to think about how our faith shapes us and what it shapes us for. Are we just called because Jesus thinks we're really swell people who deserve good things? I don't think so. I think we're called because Jesus knows that we have it within us to do amazing things just like those disciples did. And I don't expect all of you to leave your homes and just spread yourselves across the whole of the world bringing the good news. But as each of us moves through our daily lives, we are called to show forth in our actions, in our attitudes, in our words, the love of God that we know so that we might reflect it out into the world. And that as people of faith, one of the things we're called to is to be curious, to ask of God what it is I am here for. What are you calling me into next? Where do you need me to go to further the mission that Jesus began all those years ago across the sea? That we are called to not be afraid to ask of God what it is God needs of us. Because it's a two-way street. We spend a lot of time, I think, asking God about how God can meet what we need. And God is there to meet all of our needs. But I don't know how much time we spend, I don't know how much time I spend anyway, thinking about What does God need of me? What am I called to do in this situation or in this relationship or in this place? So the through line of the whole scriptures in the human relationship with God is God telling us to not be afraid. Because faith has no place for fear. Faith is about trust and confidence in what God is calling us to and what God offers to us. And that the way of God is the path to the best possible life that we could have. And not a life that is without sorrow or pain or loss, but a life that is filled with love and connection and mercy and grace. That's the abundant life that God calls us into. But if we are afraid to ask where God needs us to be, if we are afraid to know what the purpose of our mission is, of our lives, then we may fall short of that abundant life which is so freely offered to us because we were afraid